Now we're going to be calling up somebody who's been popping up throughout the conference. He doesn't really need much of an introduction, but he will be speaking on the global cocoa agenda. Is it a roadmap or a dead end? Ladies and gentlemen, Antonie Fountain from the Cocoa Barometer Consortium.
Thank you all very much, everybody. Who of you has been to every single one of the 5 World Cocoa Conferences so far? A couple of hands, good. Some of you will have seen me a couple of times. I'm going to try to keep this interesting for everyone by not saying too many things that I've said before, but I've been asked to speak about the global, this is too far already. I've been asked to speak about the global cocoa agenda. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail in a few minutes about what the global cocoa agenda is, whether it's a roadmap or a dead end. But what I actually want to talk to you guys about is the question of hope. And why would I talk about that? Well, for the following reason, that I've been involved in sustainable cocoa for the better part of 2 decades. And the second most asked question I get is, how do you keep hope? And then I'm always reminded of a quote by St. Augustine of Hippo, a North African church father, many, many, many centuries ago. And he said that hope has 2 beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way the world is, and courage to ensure that the world does not remain the way it is. And this is what I keep coming back to when I look at my work, because I feel both anger and courage at the same time. It's not just one thing. I actually love the way it sounds in French. It's even better. It actually alliterates it. Colère et courage, and that really somehow drives me in my work as well. Why do we do what we do? It's because we have hope, and we have hope in equal measures, anger and courage of what's going on. And I would like to ask you all, if there's one message you take away from me today, is to ask yourself the question, what gives me anger about the way the world is in cocoa? But also to ask yourself, what gives me courage? Far too often, we only stick on the one thing that's easiest for us. Oh, I'm a hopeful guy. I'm only going to talk about the courage part. I'm only going to look at the good things. Or, oh, I'm a little bit of a pessimist, or I'm a critic, so I'm only going to look at the bad stuff. No, if you do that, you're a little bit like a bird trying to fly with one wing. Not only does it not work, but you look pretty silly while you're doing it as well. We need to be realistic, which means we need both the anger and the courage. So, what makes you angry about the current state of cocoa? What makes you hopeful about the current state of cocoa? However, and I see Michel looking at me already, he has asked me to come here and to speak about the global cocoa agenda, whether it is a roadmap or whether it is a dead end. So, the global cocoa agenda is... who of you actually knows what the global cocoa agenda is? Let me just start with a question there. A few hands. Of course, Torben knows what the global cocoa agenda is. It was actually assigned in Abidjan at the first World Cocoa Conference in 2012. And it was a document outlining a whole set of things that collectively as a sector we were going to do to make cocoa sustainable. It's got quite a few pages, and I've tried to summarize it in 3 bullet points. And this is, I promise you, this is the only slide you will see of me that has bullet points. It was an attempt to improve the transparency and the coordination of our sustainability efforts in the cocoa sector. It was also the launch of the idea that every cocoa-producing and importing country needed to develop national cocoa action plans, working at what are we doing at our national level to make cocoa sustainable. And what it also did is it outlined individual responsibilities for a whole bunch of different actors in the sector. For farmers to incorporate good agricultural practices and to better self-organize. For civil society to support farmers and to increase awareness of sustainability issues. For producer governments to develop national action plans and provide extension services and ensure an enabling environment. for companies to improve the impact on traceability, to respect the law, to improve their purchasing practices. This was actually already in the Global Cocoa Agenda 12 years ago. And for consuming governments to develop national action plans, to strengthen multi-stakeholder initiatives, and to improve transparency and provide financial support. I am not doing this entire document justice with this short rundown, but that's pretty much what it was. And now, 12 years later, I've been asked, can we look back at this Global Cocoa Agenda? Was it a roadmap? Was it a dead end? And when I've been reading the Global Cocoa Agenda, which I've been doing quite a bit in preparation for today, I do see both courage and anger in this conversation. And you know what the funny thing is I've actually, in preparation for this, I've sent a lot of you guys the question over the past weeks. Because it's not just me, I'd like to know a lot more from a lot of you. I've asked a lot of you, what gives you anger about cocoa? What gives you courage about the cocoa sector? And it's actually been a real pleasure to read the responses from a lot of different people. I've asked it to farmers, I've asked it to NGOs, I've asked it to government representatives, I've asked it to the private sector, and I've got a lot of different answers. And interestingly enough, I saw a lot of different people giving a lot of issues about courage and to see how far have we come. But far too often, we don't look at it in the right perspective. Courage and anger here, but there's a picture behind the courage and anger. But can you properly see what picture this is? No, because we only see it in part. But if you take a step back and look at the whole thing, you can actually see the whole picture. And this is often how we approach the progress that we're making. Who of you has an annual report? Who of you has an annual report? Who of you has a 10-year report? We tend to look at things in increments of 12 months. Our work is to change the world, really all of us. And you can't change the world in 12 months, no matter how hard you try it. And believe me, I try every day. It doesn't work that way. We're looking at change with the wrong perspective. We're looking at it with far too much detail on the individual pixels, and we forget to take a step back and look at what the big picture is. 12 months is not a good perspective, but 12 years, and it's been 12 years since we got together in Abidjan in 2012. 12 years is a much better perspective to look at how far we have come. It becomes easier to identify the things that give us courage, but it also becomes more painful and honest to identify the things that give us anger. Now, I've promised you not a lot of bullet points, but I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. This is a picture of a film called The Lord of the Rings. And this is a moment where two of the main characters, and there's a lot of main characters, two of the main characters, Samwise Gamgee and Frodo Baggins, they're on an adventure, and they've gone for a long, long journey already. And at this point in the film, Sam, that's the guy on the left, he stops, and Frodo looks back at him, and he asks, "So what's wrong?" And Sam says, "If I take one more step, then I'll be the farthest from home that I've ever been." And I actually think all of us in cocoa are Sam Gamgee at the moment. If we take one more step in our sustainability journey, we are further from home than we've ever been because we have come so far already. And I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about how far we've come, because I think that actually gives us courage as well. Now, I'm going to have to be honest. At the beginning of this journey, we got off to a bit of a false start, right? Like, so from 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, not much was happening. And I always have to think of the Monty Python skits in the 70s, British absurdist humor, where they had a whole series of sports events called the Silly Olympics. And one of them was the 100-meter sprint for people that were deaf. Like, everybody's lined up, and the gun goes off, and everybody's lined up, and nobody moves. That was us for a little while. We were the 100-meter sprint for people that were deaf, right? And then we kind of went into the next Silly Olympics, which was the 100-meter sprint for people with no sense of direction. And the gun went off, and people went all over the place, right? I'm trying CLMRS, I'm trying community development programs, I'm trying income accelerator programs, and we're trying productivity increase programs, we're trying diversification. There was a lot of stuff going on. right? And that's actually a good thing. Because we're on a journey to try to do things we've never done before, we're gonna have to go out there and we're gonna have to try new things. That requires courage, it requires a flexible mindset, and it requires the willingness to be wrong at times. And we've been doing a lot of that over the past years, going all over the place, trying to find new things. And one of the things that has given me the most courage of all of this is that we have so much of a better dialogue in the cocoa sector. We're actually all acknowledging problems that we weren't 12 years ago. I'll give you one example. For the 2012 World Cocoa Conference, I was summoned to the offices of the ICCO at the time by the executive director at the time. It was not Michel. And he sat us down and he said, look, we can talk about a lot of different things at the conference, but you are not allowed to talk about child labor. That is literally what happens. I was sitting in the offices of the head of the ICCO. He said, this topic is not allowed. We are so much further down the line. And in fact, when I was asking the conference organizers, why isn't there a panel on child labor? It's not because we weren't allowed to talk about it, but because we're talking about the root causes underneath it a lot more today. There's a real journey that we're making there. And that collaboration is at a sector-wide level. It's also great to see Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana collaborating through the SIGC. 12 years ago, that would have been pretty unimaginable. Massive step forward. We're seeing here in Europe, private sector and the NGOs working together to collaborate with the EU on putting in place regulation. 12 years ago, that would have been considered an absolutely insane idea that that would happen. But also, we at civil society are getting better at working together as well. I represent the Voice Network. We've got 31 member organizations from across the world. But we work very closely together, for example, with something called the Plateforme Ivoirienne pour le Cacao durable that bring together dozens of different NGOs and farmer organizations in Côte d'Ivoire. We work closely together with the Ghanaian Civil Society Cocoa Platform in Ghana that brings together dozens of NGOs and trade unions in Ghana working together. Also at that level, the dialogue has gotten a lot better. Civil society is empowered. But we're also seeing today is going to be a monumental day, hopefully, you never know, because in Strasbourg, the European Parliament is going to actually make a huge step forward. Because after today, hopefully, sustainability is no longer a voluntary choice for companies in the cocoa sector. But it actually is something that you're going to have to do because it is the law. 12 years ago, if you'd have asked me, we're going to get regulations on environmental and human rights, sustainability, I would have been doing a happy dance. So maybe by the end of today, I will be doing a happy dance because we have come so far. We have come so far. And then when we're looking at price and we're looking at livelihoods, paying a higher price for sustainable cocoa. Even 6 years ago at the last World Cocoa Conference, that would have been considered a completely impossible title for the conference. But now we are here and we all agree that this is the way forward. We don't know about the how yet. That's fine. We don't per se agree on the how yet. That's fine too. We're still running a race of people with no sense of directions. But we are coming so much further. And that is great. There's also progress made on specific individual issues. If you look at child labor, I'm actually quite hopeful about the conversations that we're seeing there. And that is because if you look across most of the metrics, child labor is actually going down. We have more children in cocoa production than we had 12 or 20 years ago. But that's because we've got a lot more cocoa farmers working in the cocoa sector than we have 12 years ago. If you look at the amount of hours they're working, if you look at the amount of different kinds of activities they're doing, if you look at the child labor prevalence rates, all of those are going down. And where 12 years ago we didn't really have any tools to tackle child labor with, by now we're actually getting closer to having tools to tackle child labor. Some companies are actually able to get on a stage and say, we know how much we're reducing child labor by. Some companies are able to say that this is through these interventions. Other companies are saying, and if you add paying your farmers a fair price and giving them long-term stability, we can almost eliminate child labor over time. For the first time in the past year or a year and a half or so, I am actually of the opinion that if we do this well, we can actually get child labor off our list of main priorities. I think we can do this. And that makes me emotional I've been doing this for 20 years, and for a longest time, where was the hope on this? These are structural issues that we can never solve. But if you look well, if you take that step back, you can see that there are things that we can solve if we try. Not because it's easy, but because it's possible. We can do this. We can do this. We really can. I believe this from the toes to the top of my head. Not everybody is doing it yet, but we're on that road, people. We're on that road, and it's something that we can be hopeful about. There's a lot of things we can be concerned about. We're oversimplifying the terms, and I think we as NGOs do that wrong the whole time as well. I think we tend to, at the moment, there's a really big issue that a lot of the private sector is all of a sudden trying to run away from being more honest about this. And I think that's exactly the wrong way. I think we need to be more transparent. I also think that after this afternoon, you're going to have to be more transparent from a legal perspective. There's challenges, but there's also possibilities there. And it's so something to be hopeful for. If we look at the environment, this is actually on the agenda now. It was almost absent from the global cocoa agenda. 12 years ago, we weren't talking about deforestation in cocoa. We weren't talking about climate change. We weren't talking about galamsey. This is a photograph that was just published last week or the week before by Reuters of a galamsey farm in Ghana. It used to be a cocoa farm. It's now a wasteland. It's terrifying to see what's happening there. So we've got a real challenge where it comes to the environment, where it comes to deforestation, where it comes to environmental encroachment through mining, where it comes to climate change. Also there, things are starting to move from, oh, you can solve it if you want to no, you're going to have to solve it because it's a legal obligation. You heard me on Monday. I don't think we're per se doing a very good job at being reliable in those legal obligations. I think there's a real road to go still for the regulators to be better at the regulating it. But the fact that we're at that point is hopeful. It's hopeful. What I'd like to point out around the environment, though, is we need to watch out because our conversation always in sustainable cocoa at a global level focuses on what's happening in two countries, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And that is a big mistake going forward. Not because we need to ignore Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. No, they need to always be part of our conversations, but we need to be aware there's not that much forests left in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana to be cut down, old growth forests. A lot of those rainforests have disappeared. But there's a huge forest right next door. It's called the Congo Basin. There's a huge forest in Latin America called the Amazon Basin. And if we don't watch out, our focus on these two countries is going to actually have us miss the huge threat in other places. And I think that there's a danger there. And we often do have criticism around the policies that we see in these two countries, and I think we need to continue having a conversation around how they can improve. But at the very least, they have policies in place, right? That's a starting point, and a lot of other places don't have those starting points yet. I actually think that within the next 3 to 4 years, we'll see Ecuador overtake Ghana as the world's second largest cocoa producer in the world. I think there is a new dynamic and a new reality in the cocoa sector going forward. And I think that if we want to have an honest conversation, the global cocoa conversation needs to be a global conversation and not just a West African one. And I think this is also in the interest of the two current cocoa producer countries, because I think that Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire have a stake in the game to make sure that everybody is playing by the same rules as well. The last thing that I'm on the one hand optimistic about, and the other thing that gives me anger, is the issue of transparency. What gives me courage, and what somebody sent me, because I've been asking these questions, somebody says, what gives me courage is that we are finally talking about the right things. And when we're sharing data and information, it is possible to do so. Companies and other parties are really willing to share. Yesterday morning, there was a side event where we launched something called the Cocoa Income Inventory, which is bringing together data sets from lots of different people, lots of different organizations, lots of different companies that are much more publicly sharing their information around what are the challenges you're facing. There is so much more acknowledgement of the size of the problem than we ever had. ESG reporting is making it mandatory, not just on environmental issues, but the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Green Claims Act is going to make it obligatory for companies to be honest about the size of the problems they have. Now, there is a real problem around transparency on child labor at the moment. And I'm just going to be very clear and specific about this. In the last year, year and a half, we have seen too many companies starting to walk back the transparency on the size of the problem in their specific supply chain and on how well their impacts are working in the specific supply chain. There's a concern for legal risks that is actually making law firms advising their corporate clients to say, don't say anything about this anymore. This is a danger for you as a company if you choose that path. It is a legal risk because this afternoon we're going to get a law that says you have to be honest about this. It is also a reputational risk. And I will tell you why. A man called Martijn Brons, he's a cocoa trader, traded for Cargill for a very long time. He wrote a very interesting piece around the current market dynamics. And he said, I've been trading cocoa for 30 years, and one thing that we know is cocoa always gets out. Regardless of the situation, cocoa will find a way out. It will actually find its way to the market. And the same thing goes for truth. Truth, like cocoa, always comes out. And it is up to you as companies to choose how you want that truth to come out. Do you communicate about that in your ESG reports? Or do you wait for whistleblowers and highly critical investigative journalism to do so? It's up to you. But if I were running a company, I know what I'd prefer to do. But that same sense of transparency also is required at a government level. And I think that far too often we're missing that as well in the major cocoa producing regions across the world. What are the real challenges? We need an honesty about the scope and size of the problem before that scope and size of the problem becomes so big that we see our yields decrease drastically. We can't just blame a weather pattern for what is happening in West Africa at the moment. There's a lot of other problems underpinning that require a lot more transparency, and that transparency will then lead to actually effective policies to challenge the situation. Because, in the words of Martin Luther King, there is a fierce urgency of now. We're looking at cocoa prices that are very high, and somebody came up to me and said, oh, you must be happy, the cocoa prices are finally high. No, ladies and gentlemen, I am terrified. Because we've been speaking with a whole bunch of farmers in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana, and they are doing terribly this year. The reason why the prices are high is because the harvests are disastrous. And so we might raise the price, but if you don't have cocoa to sell, then you don't really have a lot of use of higher prices, because income is price times volume. And the volumes are terrible at the moment. Cocoa farmers have just got a price increase, but they don't have cocoa to sell at the moment. And they still need to wait 8-9 months before the next harvest can be sold. The vulnerability and the abuse that they are actually open to at the moment is terrible. There is a fierce urgency of now. And that's not just for Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. In general, I've just been telling a lot of hopeful things, but at the same time, farmers are still poor, trees are still being cut down, and children are still working. And it would be my argument that those 3 metrics should be the key metrics of the global cocoa sector. Let's stop the trees from being cut down, let's stop the kids from working, let's stop the farmers from being poor. And on that level, we still have a very long way to go. We've also got the very big challenge that we're in the middle of a crisis. And crises can be abused by those that have power far too easily. Naomi Klein wrote a book about this several years ago called The Shock Doctrine. And if you do not think that currently we are seeing a consolidation of power in the cocoa sector because of this crisis, you are much mistaken. Smaller traders, people that do not have a lot of cash to pay the high prices at the moment, are being pushed out by the large players. And unless we put in place the right policies within the next 3 or 4 years, we'll see a huge increase of market concentration in a market that is already, let me put it this way, fairly concentrated. We really need to watch out that that does not happen too much. We also need to watch out, and I said this yesterday in a panel on supply management as well, unless producer governments start getting their policies in order this year, in 4 or 5 years' time, we're going to see a vast increase of cocoa production, primarily in countries outside of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. I'm talking about places like Liberia, Cameroon, Nigeria, Congo, Ecuador, Peru. These countries will all vastly increase their cocoa production in the planting that is happening now. Those plantations will come into production in about 2027, 2028. And unless we watch out, what's going to happen is the price will collapse, probably to maybe even only $1,500, $1,700 a ton. And farmers will be in dire straits. And so this is a challenge really to the governments of all the producing nations. We need you to come together to acknowledge not just the urgency of now, but to look 4 to 5 to 6 years ahead. This is a challenge for politicians, because 4, 5, 6 years ahead is after the next election cycle. And this is going to require courage, because you might not be there to reap the benefits, but the people that you represent in your countries will. And so this is a plea to all of those of you that are in the political arena, is to look beyond the mandate of the next elections and to look to the interests of the farmers in the long term. Because some of us are not here in a 4 to 6 year cycle of elections. Some of us have been doing this for decades and will be here in decades. And we are asking you urgently to protect the future of cocoa and not just the short-term interests there. But, as somebody else said, what gives me courage is we are in a crisis, and you should never waste the opportunity of a good crisis. Things become flexible when things are tricky. And so this crisis should give us an opportunity to move forward. So there's a lot of things that give us courage and that give us anger about the past and about the present. But we can also look forward and think, okay, so how do we change that? And I would like to say that if not now, then when will we ever change the cocoa sector? This moment is probably the first time that the private sector agrees with NGOs that supply and demand in the market might not be the best way to find the price point, right? Because at the moment, the private sector is not too happy with the way the price is working. Governments in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana are concerned about solvency. Governments in other countries are concerned about the lack of transparency and grip because everybody is just selling in a Wild West situation. If not now, then when will we actually make that change? And then the second question is, if not in cocoa, then where? Because one of the things that most people gave back is things that gave them courage, and also for myself. I've been working a lot in other sectors over the past couple of years, working in coffee, looking at the people in the cotton sector, looking at the vanilla sector. They're all coming to us. And you know why they're coming to us? Because they're trying to say, we'll have a bit of what you're having, please. What you guys are doing is special. What we are doing here in cocoa is special, guys. If we can't change the way we're doing things, I don't think any commodity can. So if not now, when? If not here in cocoa, where? Now, what would that change look like? And I think it's very important to start with the point that it's not only about price. Sorry, Michel, I know it's the subtitle of the conference. It's not only about price, because we need to do a lot of other things beyond price. And that means that measures that only look at price should be taken with a grain of salt. Now, we don't have a lot of measures that only look at price, and in fact, there's only one that looks at price. Am I running out of time already?
You ran out of time 5 minutes ago.
No. I have another couple of minutes, but
Like to take questions?
yes, understood. Understood. I had 25 minutes, right? Okay, good. We need to, the only measure that's about price is the terminal market, because that actually doesn't look at quality, doesn't look at where it's coming from. It only looks at supply and demand and doing the price. And I would say we have to decommoditize the cocoa sector in the way that we've decommoditized labor in all of the global north. Labor does not have a supply and demand basis for the lowest wages. It's actually got minimum wages. We should do a similar thing in cocoa. One of the first steps in that is to require companies to engage in good purchasing practices, which is paying a fair price and having a bottom at a living income reference price. It's de-risking the farmers because it's not only about price, it's also about the exposure that farmers have. So give them long-term contracts, give them security of sales, but make those contracts asymmetric because otherwise you force them into contract farming, and that is also not the way forward. And companies need to be transparent and accountable about their purchasing practices. But it's not just about purchasing practices, it is also about governance. And what is the issue about governance? That is really an issue where the producer governments have a real role to play where it comes to rolling out infrastructure, putting in place transparency on government income and expenditures, giving clarity on the price and on how much of that goes to the farmer, how much of that goes to the government. It is also about reliability of rights to land and tenure. It is also about actually most of the big cocoa producer countries, if you look at Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, are net food crop importing countries, but they're agricultural nations. What about putting in place a rural development policy that looks at a broader set of issues, of developing the countryside, not just developing a cash crop commodity? We need to move forward on those issues a lot more. And we need to begin with the end in mind. And I didn't choose this picture by accident at the beginning. When I turned 18, my father gave me a print of this painting. He says, this is something for you to look forward to the rest of your life. He was once at a lecture of a very old lady who, as a young child, her family had this actual painting in their house. And she would spend hours looking at this painting. It was her favorite painting in their parents' estate. And she was an art critic, and she says there's a lot of different painters, a lot of different sewers that Van Gogh, this is a painting by the Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh, he's painted a lot of le semeurs, the sower. But this is the only one that he's done where the ground is yellow. And in the Auvergne, where he was actually painting, the ground is dark, really dark black. It's not yellow. And she says, at some point it dawned on me, Van Gogh was painting this because he saw that the farmer was seeing the golden grain, the end in mind before he started. And this is how we need to change the sector. Now and here in cocoa, we need to begin with the end in mind. The way we do that is together. And the way we do that is that we realize that things will not remain the same. We cannot base our future plans purely on now, because the only thing that we know will change, the only thing that we know will stay the same is that things will change. The only constant in life, I'm originally a historian. There's one thing in every book that you read about history. The only thing that's on every history book, every page of every history book is change. It's the only thing. Things will change, and it's up to us to choose how we will change that. I said I have only one slide with bullets. I lied, I have 2 slides with bullets, but this is my last one. That change will be a regulated cocoa society. This is the roadmap for the future. A regulated cocoa sector, a decommoditized cocoa sector, where we've put in a security for all farmers and all laborers in the sector. A transparent sector where both the private sector and the public sector can be held accountable to the promises they make. It's a sector where supply is managed to avoid the ups and downs the way that we have seen in the last year. And it's a professionalized sector where farmers are actually farmers because they choose to be farmers, because they want to be farmers, because farming is actually an exciting prospect for them. And if we build a sector like this, gosh, people, I have so much hope. With anger in one hand and courage in the other, we can do this, but not if we continue our business as usual. So I will end with the question I started with. What gives you anger and what gives you courage? Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much to Antonie for that very, very inspiring speech and giving us lots to think about. And just for the record, you spoke for 35 minutes. which gives us very little time for questions. So please, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to be brief when you ask your questions. We don't want 10 minutes of comments before your question. So state your name, where you're from, and your question. We already have an eager hand up front. So we'll have about 5 minutes for questions and then go to the moderators who will give us feedback from the tracks yesterday. Go ahead.
Thank you, Leanne. Hello, my name is Hilary Barry. I'm from Lady Agri. Very short question. Antoine, thanks for an amazing and inspiring speech. But my question is, what about women? I didn't hear anything about it in the speech. And I think there's a lot of, I see a lot of hope with women-led cocoa cooperatives establishing themselves across countries. I see interprofessions taking an angle on gender. So I would love to hear it from your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you for pointing out. That is a complete omission on my side. Mea culpa. Actually, I'd like to point out I was in a panel on Monday, and that was a complete male-only panel, which is a complete shame. I did try to change that beforehand. It was hard to do, but I always say that if the devil invites me to hell to speak about sustainable cocoa, I will still go, but I do always make it a point. But I forgot to put this in here, and I should have, and I'm sorry about that. The thing about women equality in cocoa is the following. If we do not do that, not only are we flagrantly breaching the concept of human rights, we're also being incredibly stupid. Because female equality, gender equality, is not just a matter of human rights, but that in and of itself should be enough for us to be very excited about the concept of human rights, and of women's rights, and I am. But it is also that there is not a single metric in all of the sustainability challenges that we have in cocoa that gets better if only men are involved. In fact, every single problem, whether that's child labor or poverty or deforestation or transparency in governance and democratic decision making, it is all worse if it's only men. Every time, across the board, not just in cocoa, by the way. This is a problem in every country of the world. And so it's not just a problem of gender, of human rights, it's actually a problem of if you want to have an effective business strategy and you don't specifically target women in that, then you're actually succeeding, you're planning to fail. So thanks for that really important point. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. We have a question at the back.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nanaya Rubin from Ghana. My question is very short. Antonio, you have a little idea about the West African continent, and you know cocoa farmers are aging. Most of them are around the age of 40, 55, 60. The probability that we might be losing them is very high in the next few years. How are we encouraging youth to go into cocoa production because prices are low and they are all moving into the urban city?
Thanks, Ruben. I'd like to point out, Ruben is one of the members of the Ghanaian Civil Society and Cocoa Platform doing amazing work in Ghana, working to actually hold local authorities and the private sector, they're accountable on what's going on. Youth will come when cocoa is attractive. I think that we need to make cocoa an attractive proposition, and then young people will come. I would put one slight nuance on this idea that cocoa farmers are aging. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, and for almost 20 years, cocoa farmers have been aging, and the average age of a cocoa farmer has been about 55 years. Now, if that average is about 55 for 20 years, somehow, somewhere, the math is also challenging. Now, however, I would say that in the last 3 years or so, especially in West Africa, I'm afraid that cocoa has reached a breaking point. And so for some farmers, with the cost of living crisis, with now the current productivity collapse, et cetera, that is a change in the dynamic that I'm afraid that we're really going to have to do an extra effort to make cocoa interesting, because farmers are selling their land to Galamsey. Farmers are moving to the city now. We're seeing yields collapse terribly because there's also been far too little incentive. And for 30, 40 years, we've been okay as a sector with this extreme farmer poverty, both from a perspective of the private sector as well as from the producer governments to a large extent. And when I say we've been okay with it, we've always said that we're against it, but the actual actions to help move the needle have never been allowed to cost us too much. And so our actions have been okay with it, even if our words haven't. So I think that breaking point is causing a real urgent situation in both Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to make cocoa an attractive proposition again, because it has become in the last 3 years a terribly unattractive proposition.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, one from the back, and we'll come to the gentleman in front. And of
Merci.
course, I can't. Are you going to be provocative?
Thank you very much, and congratulations for this brilliant presentation. Your proposition of courage and then anger, juxtaposing that with transparency. Transparency, you know, one side, I was expecting to see a complementary side being trust, because within the industry, there's a lot of mistrust. If you take a bar of chocolate, 3 key ingredients there. You have the cocoa is there, and then you have sugar, you have milk. And now, milk is very suspicious of cocoa, just as cocoa is also very suspicious of milk, because in both cases, they are causing deforestation. And even with milk, it's worse, because it generates methane, which has a higher propensity to cause atmospheric warming than even carbon dioxide.
Honorable Aidu, can I ask you to please get to your question?
I'm landing. I'm still in there. Let me land. So what you do say about trust, so that the issue of transparency will become more meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Aidu. There's 2 questions here. The question around trust. In Dutch, we say that trust leaves at the speed of a horse and arrives with the speed of someone that is crawling. And so trust is built over time, but lost in minutes. And I think the only way you get trust is by spending time with each other and by being honest with each other. Because you don't build trust through lies, you build trust through honesty. You don't build trust through beautiful words, you build trust through vulnerability. And I think that quite a lot of you, we've spent long hours in meetings violently disagreeing on content, but starting to acknowledge that the other person also cares about this topic, right? Sometimes till deep in the middle of the night, sitting at bars discussing, I think it needs to be this, I think it needs to be that. Through these corridors, through these conversations, we build trust. And I would argue that we build that trust a lot more the minute the plenary sessions finish and we walk out the doors together and we shake hands and we have some conversations than when we stand on these stages and when we throw hand grenades from our own trenches and nobody moves, right? So it's the movement happens outside of these things. That's the question around trust. I love that you brought up the idea of milk, because actually over the past months, we at Voice and other civil society here in Europe have been working with the European Milk Board to see, can we find a way to actually, because the problems with low pricing in cocoa are not problems of low pricing in cocoa. We've completely screwed up how we price every agricultural product in the world, which is why there are tractors that are like blocking the streets of this city at a regular level as well. And the European milk farmers want to actually see a fair price. And the cocoa farmers want to see a fair price. So is there a way to work together? So I love the example of milk, because we're talking with the European Milk Board to see how we can do that. But the point of trust, and I'll end there because I know that we're running out of time here. How we build trust is by getting to know each other, by not shying away from the hard conversations, and to keep that conversation going, which we've done with a lot of you, because I remember back in 2012 at the first World Cocoa Conference, NGOs were allowed one 5-minute speech on the stage, and that was it. There were no farmers, there was no civil society, because we didn't like each other. We only met each other from opposite sides of an argument. And the cocoa sector reminds me a lot of the ending of Rocky IV, and that's where I'm ending. Rocky IV, the great boxing movie of 1984, where Dolph Lundgren and Sylvester Stallone knock it out together in this big stadium in Moscow. And at the end, of course, Rocky wins because it's an American Hollywood movie. And he gives a speech there, and he says, once he's won, he says, "At the beginning of this fight, you guys didn't like me very much, and I didn't like you very much either. But whilst we were going on, I felt that change. And if I can change, and if you can change, everybody can change." Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.